Welcome everyone. I'm Casablanca Adu. I'm a second year DPhil student, and along with Eliza McCarthy, a first year DPhil student, and along with Eliza McCarthy, a second year DPhil student, we're going to be co-chairing the Faculty of English, which is Black History's month event. Here today we're here to celebrate the recent release of Diana Evans' 2025 essay collection, I Want to Talk to You and Other Conversations, which combines journalistic portraits of contemporary cultural icons with more personal, meandering essays on her own authorial praxis and how it's been profoundly shaped by the writers such as James Baldwin, John Rees, and Toni Morrison, alongside with more recent pieces which examine life in the wake of pandemic, George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd, and Grenfell Tower tragedy. Diana Evans is a novelist, journalist, and critic whose essays and literary criticism regularly appear in the national newspapers. Most famously, Evans was an editor of Pride magazine, a lifestyle and cultural publication which focuses on Black women's lives in the UK. She's of Nigerian British mixed heritage, a cultural identity that greatly informs many of her novels and essays, notably her first novel, 26A, which was published in 2005 and was shortlisted for the Whitbread Book Award and the Commonwealth Writers' Prize. Eliza, if you want to continue.
So the book is arranged in a broadly chronological order, though the essays are grouped thematically. I Want to Talk to You draws primarily on Evans's varied background as a writer, where she regularly grapples with the different demands of fiction, writing, journalism, at times poetry. And this tension between different forms is a theme that she regularly explores quite extensively within the collection. So we have interviews from Cuban ballet dancer Paulo Acosta to interviews with Maya Angelou, Viola Davis, a phone call with Alice Walker at one point, to longer, much more introspective pieces that examine her authorial relationship and her literary inheritances with Jean Rhys, and that particular very pertinent essay, The Charisma of Despair. So Evans' writing is part social commentary, part memoir, part creative nonfiction, and we're really excited to hear your thoughts on it today. And we hope you really enjoyed the experience of reading it. So without further ado, if Kieran is happy to start us off, and then maybe if we go to Elika after that, because she has to leave quite quickly. So if we do Kieran, then Elika, and then we'll work it out from there. Okay?
Cool. Okay, everyone can see me now. Okay. Hi, I'm Kieran. I'm a second year DPhil student like Eliza. And I just want to say I'm very grateful to the chairs and to the other participants in the panel for helping make this event. I'm really looking forward to a fascinating conversation, and I'm really thrilled to have the opportunity to participate. So what I'm going to offer here is some of my general reflections on reading the book, and then I'm going to home in on sort of one particular essay within it to try and provide some more depth, particularly the piece about dancing. Okay, so I'll crack on. From the opening of I Want to Talk to You, with the writer sitting in a bed next to Mariah Carey, the very dream of many a gay man like myself, to its ending with a quote from the philosopher Seneca, Diana Evans offers a rich archiving of an eclectic range of encounters, enthusiasms, and experiences. One of the most vivid threads in the writer's tapestry in this book is without doubt her appreciation of the art and solidarity with the lives of those, quote, existing on the receiving end of the construct of race across national boundaries in Britain, the Americas, and Africa. Contexts are far from identical across these far-flung locations, of course, but there is a common sense of working against the limited imaginative horizons, not to mention the material inequalities of, quote, a race-diseased world. For me, reading this collection, it has been both a pleasure and an education. A collection such as this one that ranges so widely offers the reader the pleasure of hearing a favourite artist's work described by such an astute observer. For me, that was being sent back to, quote, the massage to the heart and ear offered by the texture of Lauryn Hill's voice, or, quote, the oscillating, dreamy atmosphere of James Baldwin's novel If Beale Street Could Talk. That was a sort of clarifying and even exciting return that Evans offered. I'm guessing that most readers like me will also be guided to discover new work by the sensitive portraits the author offers. I know I'm really looking forward to listening to lots of Cassandra Wilson's music now. Evans has a keen instinct for the telling detail, a necessary attribute for both what she calls her fiction voice and her journalism voice. One detail I remember is the fact that the first name of Thandiwe Newton, the terrific actress who plays Beloved in the film adaptation of Toni Morrison's landmark novel, actually means beloved in Zulu language. And that was one of those arresting coincidences or confluences, you could say, that took my breath away. The first section of this collection offers a range of Evans's profiles of and interviews with famous cultural figures. For all that her observations and writing style allow for an authorial personality to be inferred, as Evans herself notes, the basic dynamic of the journalistic interview is that the interviewer reveals nothing about themselves, while the interviewee is encouraged to reveal everything. If it had a comparable object, it would be a funnel. End quote. For me as a reader, this first section builds sort of desire to learn even more directly about the human being at the narrow end of the funnel, Evans herself. Therefore, the piece Once a Dancer was one of my very favourites in the book, and I'll briefly home in on it now. That piece, Once a Dancer, is the final capstone of the initial portrait section of the volume. A personal essay, it's the first piece after the volume's introduction that is so clearly about Evans herself and has no other governing celebrity personality. We might say that here the funnel gives way to the mirror. Once a Dancer begins with a dance class in London in late winter, where the participants are trying to learn the routine to Beyoncé's noughties classic, Single Ladies. This is a complicated experience for Evans. Initially, she describes accusatory frontal mirrors in the room, giving a slightly unwelcome sense of, quote, what your body looks like in relation to other bodies. Whilst bowing down in humility at the talent of Queen Bee, the dancers can feel, quote, shabby, flawed, and floundering by comparison. They do not have the same, she calls it beautification assemblage that accentuates Beyoncé's moves. This mixed experience is the prompt for a reflection on Evans's history as a dancer and, quote, the movement void she had begun to feel once switching dancing for writing as her career goal. As a student in Brighton, the reader learns, Evans had joined a dance troupe that learned and performed traditional dances from the Caribbean and different parts of Africa. They became successful touring, and Evans records the shared corporal endeavour of, quote, preserving cultures with our bodies. Evans then had an interesting experience going to Cuba for 2 months to take a course in Afro-Cuban dance, something that sheds light on her earlier profile on the Cuban ballet legend Carlo Acosta and his practice of cultural fusion. But faced with lack of opportunity, Evans ultimately chose to pursue writing as a career over dance, something that threatened to leave her in a melancholy state of, quote, after dance, the dangerous misery of motionlessness. Evans writes that back then, quote, I had thought of writing and dancing as opposing creative callings. Certainly, in an Enlightenment dualistic philosophy, they might seem that way, dance as an embodied movement art and writing as the outpouring of a mind. But this is one of those binaries like that between art and activism that Evans's book troubles. Evans comes to write a novel about dancing, an encapsulation of its nature, in her second book, The Wonder, which features prominently the story of a Jamaican boy who wants to be a ballet dancer. Evans writes that now much of my dancing is internal, still in my head, inside of music, and also I tend to think inside of sentences, the rhythms of language in the movements made possible with words. For the author, dance and writing begin to blur in, quote, the delicious feeling of movement itself, that fevered writing of oneself across the air. Back in the present day and the Beyoncé dance class, the dancers warm down to a relaxing reggae song. Easing into it, Evans becomes, quote, thankful for the way dancing can return you to your own body. The potential melancholy of the piece's title is rounded off. Once a dancer, always a dancer. I'm interested in the ways that Evans both reclaims writing as an embodied art and preserves the vital movement of her life as a dancer. Racism and prejudice can both joltingly return people of colour to their bodies. I think in this collection of Edward Enninful recounting a security guard at UK Vogue headquarters, telling him to enter the building via the loading bay rather than the front door, a shocking act of racial profiling towards the very editor of the whole magazine. Against the potential therein to alienate Black people from their own bodies, dance eventually seems to offer Evans the opportunity for the voluntary expression of embodiment and the ability to be part of a community of other bodies away from a racializing outside gaze. I'll just briefly note, as a sort of further comparison, that in the writing of dance and the dance of writing, there's an interesting point of similarity here with Evans's contemporary author Zadie Smith. Smith too has both written the novel Swing Time and an essay in her collection Feel Free about dancers and dance. In the essay, Smith writes, "The connection between writing and dancing has been much on my mind recently. It's a channel I want to keep open. It feels a little neglected, but for me, the two forms are close to each other. I feel dance has something to tell me about what I do." Both Smith and Evans in their essays quote the choreographer Martha Graham, while other shared reference points include Michael Jackson, Beyonce, and an intense love of ballet. I think perhaps what Evans's essay has that is not a focus of Smith's is the intense evocation of her own experience of embodiment as a dancer. She might say that the connection between writing and dancing has been much in her body. That's an element I hope to have begun to draw out in this brief talk. I know that many of the other panelists from speaking to them have far more expertise and research interests in Black female embodiment. So I'd love to have that maybe be part of our discussion. So that's it from me. Thank you very much. And I'll now pass back over and listen to the future speakers.
Thank you, Kieran. That was so fantastic. So much to talk about. So thank you so much for your thoughts. Elika, are you happy to go next?
Yeah, hi everyone, and what a pleasure to talk with you all about Diana Evans's collection of non-fictional writings. I mean, Kieran, I loved everything you were saying there about dance and the body, and my remarks are no way as structured though as yours. So you've set the bar pretty high. I was really drawn to this book of writings because in 2005, 2006, I kind of stumbled upon 26A through a couple of reviews and the recommendation of a friend, and I was absolutely blown away by this book. It coincided with with a novel by Chimamanda Adichie. It coincided with several books about twinness. 26A is about the loss of a twin, which turns out, as Evans makes clear in this book, was from her own experience. And I mean, it is really an extraordinary kind of. It introduced me to the sense, kind of much more than the other novels, which we're also kind of talking about related experiences, to the sense of kind of being in two bodies, and what happens when one of the twins does not thrive. Not to give too many spoilers to those who haven't yet read, and I really do recommend it, 26A. So I came to this this book with great excitement and anticipation, and I was not disappointed. I mean, Kieran's already said a lot about the dancing, which I just thought was so wonderful to think of a writer who was once a dancer reflecting on her own practice as a writer, as kind of taking on dance-like rhythms and motions. I thought that was extraordinary. But the two related points I really want to pull out that I really responded to was, first of all, Evans's incredibly clear, lucid, kind of very sympathetic, they're very generous remarks on the practice of writing and on interacting with other writers. So my related point is also her talking about the pleasures of reading, including the guilty pleasures. For example, I mean, I found it quite extraordinary that she finds so much to relate to in John Updike. You know, I mean, and that she's able to articulate so clearly what that guilty pleasure is. but it's where she talks about writing, when she talks, and also interacting with other writers. In the opening essay in particular, the introduction, and also in the essay, I've got my finger on the place, the 5 psychological stages of novel writing, that that I thought she was able, in a very compelling and actually very encouraging way, speaking as a writer as well as a reader, she was able to kind of take us through the experience of extreme interiority that has somehow to be kind of broken open. And she talks about the strategies of doing so, and the kind of the times of day and the activities that allow her to do that. But you know, the kind of the stress, but also the stimulation of the kind of, you know, breaking open of that interiority as a writer of fiction. And then also there's the incredible running alongside, which is, you know, what we have with this book, the kind of much more to her kind of fluent pleasures of writing as a journalist, and kind of something that I thought I'd be interested to hear the discussion on this. Something that I thought was quite evocative was that and Kieran already started to talk about this, is that the pieces kind of take us through Evans's career from, you know, working on Pride magazine and, you know, becoming a novelist, and then kind of sustaining these 2 tracks of writing. And you know, there's, I mean, some of the reviewers, you know, although the reviews have been very good, you made the remark that, you know, some of the pieces are a bit dated, but I quite like that. I quite like that life writing aspect, that we sort of get these different frames from across Evans's past kind of 15 years, really, more or less. So the stimulation of reading, you know, an extremely reflective, lucid writer on the practice of writing, and then also her confession of guilty pleasures, the guilty pleasures of reading. And I just adored the Jean Rhys essay. I think it is, you know, whenever I next teach Jean Rhys, I'm going to recommend that people read that essay. So that's it from me for now.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Alika. Lots of fascinating through lines to be drawn between your remarks and Kieran's. Who would like to go next? Joanna, perhaps? Are you happy to go?
Yeah, I'm happy to go next. Yeah, so thank you for including me in this panel. There's already been so much so many interesting things said. I hope I can contribute some level of something interesting as well. So yeah, my name is Johanna. I'm from the World Literature strand of the English department. And I'm going to be exploring this text from a broader context than some of what's been said before, of what seems to me to be a questioning of the nature of Black writing. So just to jump in, there seems to be, for me, a Tagorean exploration of expression going on in this book. And I'm going to butcher his name. I apologize for that in advance. But Rabindranath Tagore argues that there are 3 bonds of truth, 3 forms of expression that we use in order to forge connections with those around us. These are the bonds of reason, the bonds of necessity, and the bonds of joy. In the bonds of necessity, the truth of the artist, in this case, the writer, is put to work for a purpose. I bring this up because I feel that there is a running thread, a question, or maybe a series of questions throughout this book regarding what is Black literature? What purpose does Black literature have for the writer and then for the audience as well? What work, and I in sort of quotation marks, should Black writing be doing, if any? In my opinion, Black literature's work, its purpose has often been one of resistance, of social justice, of fighting for freedom. This Diana Evans acknowledges in the inclusion of articles written about a variety of talented Black artists doing precisely that, resisting and fighting, whether that's against, you know, oppression, against work-life oppression, things like that, or just in terms of representation, fighting for representation. But within and weaved throughout these articles appear hints of frustration, a feeling of pushback, or of resistance to the idea of resistance and the possible limitations this Black work places on the Black writer. I just want to bring attention to a quote from the James Baldwin section. I have it also with my finger on it, as Elika did. He inhabits the psychologies of the people in his narratives with a seemingly boundless reach of compassion, ascribing to Henry James's assertion in The Art of Fiction, the province of art is all life, all feeling, all observation, all vision. Yet he grappled throughout his career with the imposition, the imprisonment of race, his craftsmanship being, if not upstaged, at least maneuvered by its implicit activism. A little like his friend Nina Simone, who deep down just really wanted to be a classical pianist, but also found herself a soldier, battling a force with her music that jeopardized the music itself. And I'll stop it there because it does go on, but I feel like that kind of expresses what I'm saying. The frustration with these limitations is evident in the section, in the Updike section, which was mentioned by Elika, where at times she wonders, another quote, apologies. How often, with a little bit of anger, she notes this as well, which I think is an important note to make, that this is an expressed feeling of frustration and anger. When was the last time I'd seen a Black man or a Black woman doing something in a book that did not have anything specific and or tragic to do with racism, migration, slavery, poverty, injustice, knife crime, or exotic food? How often do middle-class Black people in books get to just live in their damn houses and open and close their wardrobes and be aware of each other's fingertips? I desired visibility on a most basic level. It seemed incredibly important all of a sudden for the purpose of the humanization and normalization of what Lauryn Hill might phrase my men and my women, that some brown person in a novel should be witnessed experiencing an ordinary domestic irritation. And I feel this desire for an expression of domesticity, of home life, it doesn't feel accidental to me, and it hints back to this Tagorean expression, which I'll touch on a little bit later. In the American fiction section, she also overtly questions the place of Black literary work, forcing us, or at least me in my reading, to wander along with her and question, what is Black literature even? The question becomes especially stark when we contrast this idea of Black literature with an idea of white literature. And I should specify white Western literature, perhaps. White lit as a searchable genre doesn't really exist. You're not going to walk into a library and ask, can I be directed to your white literature section? They will just look at the library. Here it is. So white literature, if we are going to generalize it into a type of literature, it perceives itself as the base normative form. It doesn't question its identity, its place in literary history, its literary canon, excepting maybe instances where whiteness comes up against non-whiteness. Questions of race generally are not limitations placed on white authors or characters. After all, as Diana Evans questions, did Peter Pan know he was white? If I'm 100% honest, there were things I didn't love about this book. I felt that there was an avoidance or a refusal to explore privilege. I didn't really vibe with the structure. I feel I would have preferred if it was just purely chronological as opposed to also by type of writing, just for my sense of being able to ingest and have a sense of timeline in my head. But what I can appreciate are the questions it seems to be asking. What is the literature or the art of the diaspora? What is it beyond the work of resistance, beyond the examination of race? What is it when it's allowed to express itself in in its truth, and form Tagore's bonds of joy with no reason nor work, only expression that is exclusively our own selves, no concealment or calculation. Tagore states that the bond of joy is our home. What then, Diana Evans seems to be asking, is Black literature when it's allowed to clock off work? What is it when it's allowed to go home? And that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Johanna. That was so brilliant. So many fantastic thoughts there as well. Which brings us to our last speaker, I think. Yes, Zana, are you ready to go?
Hi everyone, my name is Zana. I'm a third year English DPhil. I lost my voice earlier this week, so I'm a little bit croaky, but really happy to still be a part of this discussion. I was reading this on my sickbed this week, and it provided moments of joy, humour, pain, trauma, amongst various other emotions that all these essays sort of conjure up. And I read the collection as in total as a kind of exhibition of her life in a way. I was really struck by a lot of the essays in the portrait section, which I think what Kieran talked about, the funnel translating to the mirror. I think the whole collection almost reads as that process of transformation, as like a through line, where in these conversations with others or refractions of Blackness or people who she finds representation in, she sees herself evolving as a writer. I wanted to touch on the topic of revision and optics, because those were two things that really struck me in a lot of those essays at the start. I think that was most clear to me in the Michael Jackson chapter, which I found really interesting. I didn't know about that exhibition, but I love the work of the artist Kehinde Wiley, to quote, whose work examines the confluence of modern globalization and African cultural tradition amidst the haunting of colonial tyranny. So Wiley's work, if no one is particularly familiar, is best known for presenting prominent Black figures in the visual language of European art history. He sort of brings Blackness into the space of whiteness, which struck me as how she describes in quite graphic detail the murder of George Floyd later on in that essay as, to open quote, "It was there though, hidden in sentences, in the absences, in the white space, in the wider background." I think her attention to tone, whether it's in a painting or in life, is particularly pertinent to her understanding of historical silencing and the trauma faced by Black people in contemporary society today, as it was in history. Evans writes that the work of the artist is to recreate, reclaim, and restore the world. So then how might we better understand that by looking at the people who sort of pioneer those movements in their different forms? In the Edward Enninful chapter, he talks a lot about his positionality as a Black queer working class child who migrated to the UK from Ghana at the age of 13, and how representation, this idea of the optics of British Vogue, were at the kind of forefront of his mind when he was crafting a vision of what the publication could look like. Just a short quote from him in that is that it was very important with Vogue to normalize the marginalized, because if you don't see it, you don't think it's normal. And that ties into what Johanna was saying as well about this idea of domesticity and how the optics of seeing a prolific Black figure on the cover of Vogue makes it normal. It doesn't just stand out as an other, as it historically has been. And especially in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and the BLM movement that arose out of that, we are told that we cannot let the world return to how it was. So this sort of disjuncture between optics ties into that idea of revising European art historical genealogies that we see in the work of Kehinde Wiley. And then also is touched upon in the essay about Lynette Yiadom Boakye, who, in a similar project to Wiley, works to challenge the very idea of Western portraiture itself. So in this revisioning, in this rewriting, we see a sort of twin journey of these artists that Evans is spotlighting, but also her own career as an arc itself. Thank you. Yeah, those are my points.
Okay, thank you so much, Sana. And thank you to everyone. Such brilliant observations and readings across the board. We're now going to open it up to a bit of a general discussion. Casablanca and I have prepared some general notes and questions, but before that, is there anyone who wants to start us off? If there's any kind of sorry, I'm just in the language center, there's things going on around me. If there's anyone who wants to respond to something someone else has said first, or Casablanca, if there's anything that you want to come in with as well, please shoot off.
I was just going to go back, or come back to the question that Johanna raised about Evans's desire to deconstruct race and not basically limit herself with the impositions of racism, of having to portray certain things within her text. In fact, in an interview, she wrote that she said that there was this pressure to dissect race and to explore race as if it's our subject, a thing that belongs to Blackness, and I don't see that. I was wondering, throughout reading I Want to Talk to You, did you feel that she failed perhaps with her inclusion of Grenfell and her inclusion of George Floyd and topics of racism? Do you think she truly left behind the responsibility of Blackness, or do you think she failed, or how do you think she dealt with that? A general question.
I kind of have somewhat of an answer. I feel like maybe, and also this maybe comes back to my point of how it was structured, in terms of its chronological within the sections, but there are separate sections. And I think as you can kind of follow a narrative of her development of her writing style. Like, I think Elika brought up, this praxis of writing, and by the end of she's not at the end of her writing career, but her current writing career, I feel like you can sense there's a level of maturity or ability to come at these topics, whereas in the earlier works, I think that's where I felt more of this sort of avoidance of privilege, and not avoidance of not wanting to engage with race, but maybe not having the tools yet to be able to tackle this stuff. Like, a willingness was there to tackle some of this stuff, but the ability maybe wasn't quite there. Which is why I think it would have been more helpful to have it just purely chronological. So then you can have the context of like, oh, well, this is all just her early work, her not middle, I guess we're in the middle, and then this is the later works. Because yeah, it changes her abilities to tackle this stuff changes over time. So yeah, I guess my answer is kind of no and yes.
Thank you.
I guess that tension also is that ability or inability to address the job or the inherent nature of Black literature, and whether or not she achieves that task is one that's inherently inhibited by form in the earlier stages. And we read in real time her grappling to quickly learn how to kind of write journalistic, very short form essays in a real time work life setting. So it's interesting how form plays into that as well. Does anyone else want to come in on that?
Just to the idea of form, I just wanted to bring in on what Kieran said about basically this idea of writing, this dancing, or this embodied physical mode of writing. I noticed that it seemed like Diana Evans worked with and against the instantaneity of writing. Do she would talk about the space or angst between the initial moment, what she called the imperative and urgent moment of writing, and the end product, the novel, the essay, or the article. The novel was more of a like static, unstable, confusing, suffocating world, an enclosure that was constantly punctuated by this alive act of writing or dancing, as Kieran would put it, or by journal snippets and journal notes and random thoughts that create this form. And I was wondering what your thoughts were, and perhaps if you could speak to how I Want to Talk to You handles and incorporates this active act of writing with its finished form. Perhaps, Johanna, the kind of sporadic inclusions of pieces and the lack of chronology, between the different forms speaks to this kind of urgent awakening of the writing form, trying to wake it up and make it feel more alive, if that makes sense. So.
Yeah, just following off on that, I thought it was really interesting how she manages to kind of build this like semi-autofictional form within each essay. And I'm not sure how edited each of these pieces were from their original sources, but that, yeah, again, I'm going back to what Kieran says about the funnel and the mirror. That was really interesting to me, where the eye is kind of doing an interesting mediation of the role between interviewer and interviewee and subject and object, where none of those lines are ever really clearly distinctly drawn. And I think that resists that stereotyping or typifying of a certain Black artist or a writer or a prolific figure into any one of those categories, where actually the role of an interviewer and interviewee is sort of like dismantled or, kind of decolonized in that moment from its original sort of form or idea.
Yeah, I really love what you just said there, Zana, and it made me think back on another one of my favorite pieces, the meeting with Alice Walker, because I think it's really striking. Like it's called a meeting, not an interview, right? And there's a really interesting few paragraphs at the start talking about the sort of editors. I think was still with Pride magazine, but sort of the norms and expectations of journalistic writing. Like they didn't want to let her do the phone interview because they were worried she wouldn't be able to maintain, I think she says, a steely professional distance or something, like the sort of norms of some attempt at objectivity or impersonality that's expected of journalism. But she starts the interview anyway. But the funnel breaks down, and it's not because of her choice necessarily. It's because Alice Walker stops mid-sentence and says, basically, do I have the quote here? Oh yeah. What's wrong? You don't sound happy. And that's almost like a transformative moment in the whole book, and a sort of lived embodiment, I guess, of Alice Walker's sort of idea of Black womanist practice. She sort of makes space for the other person, even in a situation that is supposed to be a funnel, that is supposed to be hierarchical. One person is a sort of legendary prize-winning author, one is an up-and-coming journalist. So that I felt was a very, and it clearly sort of moves Evans herself a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Kieran. Thank you, everyone. This tension about kind of the Evans's ability to center herself through all of these other figures, to the extent where they almost become a medium through which she can explore various aspects of her selfhood. I wonder whether if anyone reads a certain kind of anxiety of disappearance within which comes within the process of writing this text or accumulating this text. As Zana helpfully pointed out, it's an interesting consideration to wonder what extent of editing happened here when Evans was collating all of these essays. Maybe in the process of collation, did that anxiety emerge then, or was it something that was always inherent? So yeah, we were just thinking about, Casa and I were thinking about that anxiety and the where the kind of authorial voice sits with that that or intention to that, and if that authorial voice is kind of becomes swept up in this anxiety. Yeah, and there's a wonderful quote, I think it's on page 153. The fragmentation of note taking, where her distance from journaling might cause a disconnection to the center. And there's a very early on in the writing where she talks about how journalism takes her away from the act of novel writing, and there's a huge amount of anxiety and guilt that comes with that. And then throughout the work, there's little kind of almost aphorisms that are weaved in, where it's like, you will write every day except Saturday, I think it is. It's a post-it note on the wall above her desk, and little kind of rituals. I just wondered if anyone wanted to speak to that.
I don't really have a fully formed thought on this, but I do think it's interesting in terms of kind of thinking about optics as well, and how much, because I do think in the beginning, maybe in the introduction, she does say that she hasn't done any editing, especially on the earlier works. She kind of wanted to present them as they were. I believe that is the case. So it does seem that there is a wanting to present herself, at least, of this authorial voice and the growth of an authorial voice. Whether that's true, how much of that is true or not, because I know for me, I would be incredibly tempted to do some sort of editing. So yeah, I think it would be really interesting. This would be an interesting book to see, like, what sort of, how it was put together, like, you know, what sort of conversations were had about what was left out, what writings were left out. Yeah, I think it would be interesting to track the making process of this book, because I think it would tell us a little bit more about what level of intent there was, and about presenting an authorial voice, or if there even was an intent.
Yeah, completely agree. I think the selection process, because I'm sure there was a big stack of essays and other writings that were not included in this, and yeah, it would have been so interesting, I'm sure, to know a bit more about that selection process and what specifically led, like, the granular decision-making process between exactly what order these essays came in and things like that. We were wondering as well, this is an essay by a Black British author about what it means to be Black and British. We were looking specifically at the essay Bad Nigerian Daughter, and they're about this tension of being properly British or badly Nigerian, or being kind of Black in Britain but British in Nigeria, that kind of disjunct between those two separate parts of her identities. And this all kind of contained in the short interaction where her mother gives her the Tupperware box full of ingredients to make a Nigerian dish, which is one of my favorite scenes in the novel. And that kind of troubled coexistence of dual parts of her identity. So we were just wondering, what do you think that this book gestures to? Does it gesture towards an answer of the question, what does it mean to be Black British? What is Black British literature?
Yeah, sorry, just to add to that, there was just this idea we were talking about where it seems like for Evans, she can't, to be Black British, she can't be Nigerian, or she has to be a bad Nigerian in order to be a good British person. She talked about this earlier in 2018 during an interview for the release of her book, Ordinary People, where she was upset with the fact that the cover for her book had this African cloth, and she was like, I'd put so much into this book. Let me get the quote. She said, I didn't like the cover of Ordinary People at first. I spent 7 years writing a book about the Britishness of Black British people, and then I was presented with this book wrapped in African cloth. It had certain connotations of othering. So we're basically, as Eliza said, wondering, what does it mean to coexist as both Nigerian and Black British? Does one have to be marginalized? Her mother, for instance, in the chapter Eliza mentioned, was not her full self in England, but when she went back to Nigeria, she was able to be centered. So yeah, if anyone could talk towards that centering and marginalization, and if you can be Black British and Nigerian, or if you have to be one or the other, that makes sense.
Well, in terms of Black British literature, I think one thing she's quite keen to emphasize, or feel she has to emphasize a lot, I'm thinking of the Toni Morrison chapter here, is its difference from the African American experience. That's she writes, British stories, of course, are different from American stories. The history is different, the scope, the culture, yet there's been a tendency in cultural discourse to examine Black writing under a single umbrella. And then she says, by the same token, the idea that there is any such thing as Black writing is as absurd as saying there's white writing. So I think there's another sort of slight, there was perhaps a more widely culturally established African-American tradition that was through sort of prizes for people like Toni Morrison and Alice Walker that had a wider cultural prominence perhaps earlier than sort of equivalently talented Black British authors. But I think that's really important. I feel like there's a real anxiety about being sort of flattened under the umbrella, that umbrella there, while also taking great inspiration from the work of particularly women, particularly Maya Angelou, Toni Morrison, Alice Walker. I don't know if that really answers your question, but it's something in terms of it. But Black British literature always has to be positioned and affirmed as not American, I guess, if that makes sense.
I think I totally agree with this kind of wanting to separate from the umbrella of African American literature. I think that while also being so heavily influenced by it as well, I think is a really interesting juxtaposition and tension. And I think for me, it also kind of goes back to, I think, I can't remember who initially brought it up, but this idea of twinness and this idea of there are kind of multiple twinnesses going on in terms of like identity, like this dual identity of, you know, heritage versus where you're currently from. And then you have the twinness of the African American Black literature and Black British literature. And then you have the actual literal twinness of her twin. And I think all of they're all, I think that's maybe kind of what makes the grief kind of comes in as well, which those the any of the bits where she talked about the twin were like, I was just floods, tears, but I think that there is like a element of separation. There does feel it's like that, like kind of conscious separation, and not discarding of one half of your twinness, which kind of goes throughout all of the work. So, and it does seem to be kind of present in her relation to her self-identity. Not that she disregards her heritage, but like, yeah, there does seem to be like, in order to be an English black, she identifies, it seems, Black British first, and then other things come after. So yeah, but yeah, that's my thoughts on it.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. all of you. Yeah, I was just going to say, what do you think? I was just thinking of At Tony's Church, the chapter At Tony's Church, and when she talks about, I'll read the quote. The most pivotal union I found with Morrison in my own writing is in her desire and attempt to deconstruct race, to highlight the existence of its everyday language with declothing herself of it, and searching instead for a new chamber of communication. I was wondering, do you feel that if this book brings about this new chamber of communication, if you can find that she finds this new chamber of communication, she finds this merging of her journalist and fictional voice. And yeah, that's basically it before we end quickly.
I'm going to be a little bit, I don't know if this is going to be controversial or not. I don't think she does. I think that she kind of raises the questions and then leaves you with the questions, is what it felt like with me. I didn't feel that there was I don't think the purpose necessarily was to come to conclusions. I think maybe it was to raise questions, rather than be like, and this I think is the answer. It's like, you know, for situations like this where we can have discussions about it, away from her, like she's doing her own thing. But yeah, no, for me, I don't think that she did come to any sort of conclusiveness, which was a bit of a shame, I thought. It kind of left it feeling a little bit surface, for me. But I also think it comes down to, I think Zana mentioned optics, and I think when reading this book, I was kind of also thinking about who this book was for and who the audience would predominantly be. And I think if we're thinking about audience, I think that, you know, these are important questions to be raising for people that some of these things might not necessarily be known to them. I think for me, some of these things were already known to me, so I needed to personally would want to go a little bit deeper, but not everyone needs that. Sometimes you just need to ask the question and then have the discussion. So yeah, my long-winded answer was that. My short answer is no.
Yeah, I suppose I would agree with that. I mean, some of these pieces, like particularly the journalism pieces, will have had to be produced in sort of like a week, 2 weeks, sort of very tight deadlines. So maybe it would be sort of too harsh to like expect a complete sort of deconstruction or escape of like the world disease of race, as she calls it, like under that kind of pressure and with sort of commercial sort of margin sort of expectations of what readers want that in different institutions have. I do think though, I agree with you, Johanna, like it definitely doesn't answer that, but I think it is the sort of the charting of the beginnings of an attempt, and by sort of placing together the attempts of others as well. I think particularly like you raised earlier, Percival Everett in Erasure, and of several of the quote at the start of the Yadom Bache chapter as well. Yeah, sort of charting the steps that others have taken and the beginnings of her own desire to push on further, because she's still working, of course. Like there's still a whole career to go, and maybe this book is sort of like a marker on the journey, you know, rather than, if it's a form of life writing, you know, life is long.
And just as a little closing comment, what Johanna was saying about, you know, the things that you already know, so maybe it read more surface to you, but there are people who don't know. And there's this line at the end of the George Floyd essay where she says, open all the windows and look outwards. The further up you are, the more there is to see. And I think that is probably the kind of bracket through which we should read this collection. So, yeah.
Brilliant.
Thank you, Zana. That was
Yeah, thank you, Zana. Thank you, everyone. I guess this very last question, because I know we've only got a couple of minutes left. I think you pretty much all just answered it, but in a concise way. Obviously, the collection is called I Want to Talk to You. So who is the you? Who is that, do we think?
I think it's herself. I think it's a sort of maybe a form of echo of the journalistic self or the writer self, but also the idea that you can be very plural and communal, obviously, is evidenced in all of the other people, all the other yous that make up herself, right?
Okay. Should we end on that note? Cass, is there anything else that you want to add or come in with, or anyone else for that matter?
No, I'll leave it to the panelists. If that's it, then I would like to just say thank you so much for this brilliant discussion on I Want to Talk to You. And yeah, thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, big thank you from me as well. Thank you for making the time. I know it's already been such a busy term. But yeah, we've loved we've loved talking to you all today and hearing such varied reflections on a very much multifaceted book. So yeah, I guess we'll see you all soon. Thank you for coming. Cool. I think we're done.